Mrs. Duck and Her Friends by JJ Flores. Chapter 1. Mrs. Duck cannot find her friends. She has 3 friends. Her friends go to find some bread without Mrs. Duck. Mrs. Duck searches for them. She finds them at the lake. They are lost and sad. The 3 friends' names are Moxie, Emily, and Rhonda. Moxie, Emily, and Rhonda are swimming in the lake. Mrs. Duck goes to get some bread. Mrs. Duck comes back with bread. All the friends eat their bread and are happy. Chapter 2. Mrs. Duck finds another piece of bread. Then Emily sees a frog. The frog takes Mrs. Duck's piece of bread. Mrs. Duck hisses at the frog. Moxie gets another idea. Emily gets out of the lake. Mrs. Duck follows them. Rhonda does not follow them. Rhonda stays in the lake and plays with the small frog. The frog and Rhonda have fun. Emily, Moxie, and Mrs. Duck are thirsty, so they come back to the lake. The frog and Rhonda go away together. When Mrs. Duck sees the lake, she does not look happy. Mrs. Duck is sad because Rhonda flies away. When Emily jumps into the lake, she is happy. But Moxie does not look happy, just like Mrs. Duck. Moxie and Mrs. Duck jump into the lake to look for Rhonda. Chapter 3. Rhonda and the frog go to get something for Emily. Rhonda and the frog want to say thank you because Emily helped the frog get out of the lake. Rhonda and the frog come back and give a slice of bread to Emily. Rhonda and the frog give a slice of bread to Moxie and Mrs. Duck. The frog says, "Goodbye, I will see you later." Mrs. Duck watches and looks happy. But Moxie, Rhonda, and Emily are sad that the frog hops away. Chapter 4. Mrs. Duck looks at the lake and she sees a bird's nest. Emily looks at the bird's nest. Moxie and Rhonda thought it was their friend's home, but it was just a bird's nest. The bird is a woodpecker. Mrs. Duck gets out of the lake to look at the tree. Moxie, Emily, and Rhonda get out of the lake to look at the tree. Next, it starts to rain. Moxie tries to flap her wings, but she goes back into the lake to get a drink. Mrs. Duck goes in the lake too. Emily and Rhonda are not thirsty. Emily looks at the tree. Rhonda goes for a swim in the lake. Emily looks for holes in the tree. Emily climbs and climbs the tree until she finds a hole. She goes in the hole and looks for animals. Emily only finds a lizard. Mrs. Duck sees the hole and sees Emily go in the hole. Chapter 5. Mrs. Duck goes out of the lake. Soon it stops raining. Mrs. Duck is all wet from the lake and the rain. Emily eats the lizard. There are no more animals in the tree. The woodpecker flies away. Rhonda comes back with a surprise. It is a frog. Emily looks at Rhonda and the frog. The frog says, "Hi, everybody." Mrs. Duck runs to the frog and she gives the frog a bug. The frog says, "Thank you." The frog eats the bug. Emily flaps her wings and goes very, very high in the sky. Chapter 6. Mrs. Duck sees Emily fly high in the sky. Emily is flying to a bird's nest. Emily meets a new friend. JJ is a woodpecker. JJ is a fun new friend. JJ and Emily fly back to meet Mrs. Duck and her friends. JJ says, "Hello, Mrs. Duck." Moxie, Rhonda, and the frog say, "It is good to meet you." Mrs. Duck gives Moxie, Emily, Rhonda, and JJ a slice of bread. Mrs. Duck gives the frog a bug. Everyone has fun. Chapter 7. The frog says, Emily is a good friend. She is fun. JJ says, yes, I agree. Mrs. Duck says, hooray for Emily. The frog hops in the lake. He says, whee, as he is jumping. The frog lands in the lake next to Mrs. Duck. Mrs. Duck goes under the water. She finds a mermaid. The mermaid says, Mrs. Duck, what are you doing here? Mrs. Duck says, I want you to meet my friends. The mermaid says, okay. Mrs. Duck says their names. Emily hops to the mermaid. JJ comes to the mermaid. Moxie swims. Rhonda and the frog hop to the mermaid. Then the frog jumps over Mrs. Duck and lands beside the mermaid. Everyone becomes good friends. Chapter 8. Mrs. Duck asks the mermaid, can you make a castle with your magic? The frog says, please make the castle big. The mermaid says, I already created a castle for you. It is under the sea, and it is big, beautiful, and tall. All the ducks gathered with the frog, JJ, and the mermaid. They swim under the sea. They find their castle. They live happily together forever. The end.